Focus with Ejaz Haider. We begin this evening with a quick review of U.S.-Pakistan relations. Last Saturday, Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi told U.S. lawmakers in New York that Pakistan was seeking a broad-based strategic partnership with America, which would also cover Afghanistan. Qureshi stressed that such a partnership was the only way to look after the interests of both countries. His meeting with the U.S. lawmakers followed a congressional hearing on Afghanistan in Washington last week. During the hearing, several lawmakers and America's chief negotiator for Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad, underlined Pakistan's role in the Afghan peace process and expressed the desire to enhance bilateral ties. While the U.S. side has referred to enhanced ties that cover a broader range of issues than just Afghanistan, in real terms, the U.S. focus continues to be on a safe withdrawal from Afghanistan and Pakistan's role in that. Additionally, U.S. wants Pakistan to help it with counterterrorism efforts post-withdrawal. David Helvey, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Affairs, told the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee last week that the United States would continue its conversation with Pakistan because it had a critical role in restoring peace to Afghanistan. Helvey also said that Pakistan has played an important role in Afghanistan. They supported the Afghan peace process. Pakistan also has allowed us to have overflight and access to be able to support our military presence in Afghanistan. To discuss the challenges and opportunities that inform a relationship that has seen wild swings, I am joined by Dr. Adil Najam, inaugural Dean of the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University and formerly Vice Chancellor of the Lahore University of Management Sciences. With him is Dr. Vaqar Ahmed, economist, author, and Joint Executive Director of Sustainable Policy Development Institute. Okay, gentlemen, thank you for being on the program. Here's what I suggest. Now, we're going to step aside as far as Afghanistan is concerned, because that is something which, frankly, on this program I've talked about a number of times. So I would request Dr. Adil Najam to give us a very quick overview of what could be more than transactional in terms of, in the sense that what is it that currently exists, which is more than Afghanistan, and what could be in terms of any enhancement of those frameworks, whether it's in terms of business, trade, investment, help in infrastructure, sort of convergences on climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So let's first have that quick review, and then we can get to some specifics.
The question you ask, in fact, is much more difficult than it sounds. We have certainly on the Pakistan side, but also on the U.S. side, used this word increasingly transactional. But we've used it nearly entirely to describe something that we are unsatisfied with, rather than something that is different from what has ever been. So it is not that the relationship has always been transactional, but we have now been for so long embroiled, certainly since the Soviets first came into Afghanistan at a very deep level, in a relationship that has become deeply transactional, meaning that it is going to be a quid pro quo. It is going to be all foreign policy is quid pro quo, but it is going to be episodal. It is going to be one move at a time, depending on simply what is being asked for at that point by one or the other side, that I think either side or both sides, it is not easy for them to describe what will be different. So one way to think about it, at least in my mind, is can the two sides think about each other? Can they describe a relationship with the other that does not involve a third country? What are things this is not simply transactional, but this has become the rationale for the transactionalism between Pakistan and the US. But can we think about relationships between the two countries that do not involve a third country, meaning do not involve Afghanistan? Relationship between Pakistan and the US that do not involve.
If I might interject quickly, that is also not contingent on, for instance, with reference to Pakistan on India, or with reference to the United States and China.
Well, so exactly. That can we describe a conversation for 2 minutes about the United States and Pakistan that is not about Afghanistan, not about China, not about Iran, not about India. And in fact, both countries, and I really do think it is both countries in this case, have not been very capable of imagining that relationship. That for Pakistan, for example, if anything happens between the US and India, there's immediately this sense that, okay, what does that mean for our triangulation? If US sees anything between China and Pakistan, for example, CPEC, immediately the conversation, the thought process is, what does this mean for our triangulation? This is not to say that triangulation is not important in foreign policy, but there has to be some part of this relationship that is simply about the two. Very briefly, usually what that means is, for example, trade. Now, yes, the US is a major trade partner. But to describe this as a trade relationship, even for Pakistan, would in fact be incorrect, or to describe a very large part of it. It could be about climate change. It could be about international norms. And that is the part that is either missing or is so overwhelmed by a third-party transaction that I think we tend to call it transaction.
Okay. Let me at this point pull in Dr. Vaqar Ahmed. Now, Dr. Ahmed, let's begin with this trade and investment thing. Now, some of the figures that I have in front of me. So as far as exports, Pakistan was US's 57th largest goods export market in 2019. US goods export to Pakistan in 2019 were $2.6 billion, which was down 7.2% from 2018, but up 63.7% from 2009. And then it goes on, and then imports and all that. So all told, it's about $6.6 billion two-way goods trade during 2019. Now, this is really a pittance, frankly. I mean, you know this better than I do. So what are the challenges and what are the opportunities, given the fact that this relationship has largely been defined in the last 20 years by security, whether it's on the US side, whether it's on the Pakistani side, and in the middle of that was, of course, Afghanistan. So moving forward, what can be done to do something about trade and investment?
I'll take lead from what Dr. Adil Najam left on. And I think trade is, while of course both countries remain major trade players, trade partners, there's still a lot of potential here that needs to be explored, as you also rightly described in your question. And if you include trade and services as well, the bilateral trade between the two countries is slightly over $7 billion, which for a country like Pakistan, which has recurrent balance of payments issues, is quite substantial, I would say. And in this $7 billion, Pakistan's exports are $4 billion, something which is direly needed at this point. So I think from a purely trade perspective, I think this relationship is important to hold. US people actually forget that US also has given an EU-like, European Union-like market access to Pakistan, but it's just that the GSP facility provided by the US is a little less celebrated in the country, despite the fact that Pakistan's textile, garment, leather, and many other commodities only remain competitive after that GSP, which US has already provided to Pakistan. But then, of course, there are trade-led investment gains as well. And it's important to realize around 500 US firms who continue to work in Pakistan as well, several of whom bring in their foreign direct investment or portfolio investment. And in the pre-COVID 2019, which wasn't in economic terms, which wasn't a very good year in the economic trajectory of the country, still the US FDI in Pakistan was around $300 million. And Pakistan's FDI in US was also around $150 million. So that is also something on which both countries need to build upon, including the technology as well as the knowledge transfer possibilities that exist. Now, a large part of the amount that gets transacted is also in the startup space. So you see many of the freelancers and startup companies only now trying to explore the US market, especially after this digital transformation which has taken place, Pakistan integrating into the global digital chain, global trade value chains digitally, of course, and you've now seen Pakistani firms getting listed on Amazon, for example. So the $3 billion of remittances that you see from the United States, many argue that a large part of this is the proceeds to the freelancers, which are, of course, bound to increase as Pakistan embraces as Pakistan gets digitally integrated with the US value chains abroad.
Okay, now this is a very interesting point. So, Dr. Adil Najam, now a couple of things. One is that if we look at what we've been exporting to the United States for years and years, it's more or less the same things. We haven't really diversified. So one of my questions is with reference to that diversification, especially when it comes to IT and some other areas which are essentially now as the digital world unfolds. One, and secondly, with reference to this Amazon thing. Now, instead of everything kind of being covered by government-to-government relations, do you think there's merit in, for instance, the government of Pakistan facilitating the private entrepreneurs and innovators for them to step up to the plate and actually interest investors in the United States? And is that an area which we have previously explored or are in the process of exploring, and if not, can possibly be explored?
Yes and yes. Yes, first to the challenge of diversification, but also yes to the idea that this is not simply about government. In fact, the role of government in trade is simply in facilitating either the private sector in this country or the private sector abroad in coming into this country. And that is why in many ways trade policy is in many ways more difficult, because you actually have far less control of policy. What you have control over is creating an environment and then hopefully unleashing a lot of other actors, right? And that's more difficult, because that means you have to do something that is going to be of interest, not to one or two, three states, but hundreds and hundreds and thousands of actors. But here is the problem with both of those things, not the problem, the challenge. So I entirely agree with Dr. Vaqar on the importance of, for example, to Pakistan of the foreign, both the foreign direct investment and of foreign exchange, for example. But here is the unfortunate fact. If trade between Pakistan and US somehow became even less, it is not going to affect US economy, right? This is not a negative effect. It's not like anyone is going to notice. And even in the US, even in Pakistan, while the net amount is very important, in your everyday life, it is not that you can easily identify sectors where your economy is deeply intertwined with international trade from the US. So if you look historically, that list has been nearly the same, maybe except for IT, which just came. And in many ways, the consolidation has decreased. There was a time, for example, that Pakistan was a major, if not the major player in the international market of, for example, jute. Right? Then plastics came and East Pakistan no longer remained Pakistan, but there was a very long time when international market of cotton. Pakistan was a big enough and important enough player that relations to any other country that was working with cotton in manufacturing, etc., Pakistan had a voice. At this point, it is very difficult to say. So it's not simply a question of quantum. Macro is very important. But within that quantum, are there areas of trade where Pakistan would have a voice in the international affairs of that trade? Because either we are the biggest consumer or we are a very, very big producer in that transaction. I'll give you an example. For example, in the Middle East, with human resources, Pakistan does have that. There is the reality that, if, for example, a Pakistan-Saudi relationship, a very important part of that is the export of labor. Right? Now, again, I'm not talking about creating dependencies. I'm saying you have to be a big enough player in quantum, but you also have to be a big enough or important enough player in certain areas that a country of 200 million plus should actually be in a few of those, and it is very difficult for me to identify what those are. Similarly and so when we think about trade policy and the role of the private sector, which is why I think it is very important to increase freelancers, but it is not like the world freelance market is going to become such that anytime soon that Pakistan is going to be a very, very major thing. Very last point in one line, when COVID hit, for example, and people were very, very worried about trade. So yes, a lot of that attention was on China as sort of the factory of the world. But all across the world, people were worrying about what might happen to Vietnam. Because Vietnam had taken sort of as this role as the other big manufacturer, particularly of low-cost goods. People were worried about other countries in Southeast Asia because US companies were so dependent in their supply chains that if something bad happened there, then people were saying, okay, a lot of other things, therefore we must do something here with them. I don't think anyone was interested in Pakistan at that point because there aren't supply chains, one way or the other, in which we are that big a player. And that is where I think trade policy comes in, not simply as creating the environment, but creating those sectors of excellence or of quantum.
Very important points. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Adil Najam speaking with us. Let me go back to Dr. Vaqar Ahmed. Dr. Ahmed, Dr. Adil Najam has raised some very important points, but he's also said something very interesting, in a macro kind of way, which is to have a trade policy. Now, you know as an economist that we have had these discussions here in this country with reference to a trade policy, and a number of very fine economists are not convinced that we should have a trade policy. I can, off the cuff, I can name, for instance, Dr. Nadeemul Haq doesn't believe that there should be a trade policy, and there are others also. So give me your sense of this idea, and I being a non-economist, purely from a common sense perspective, I would tend to think that, okay, if the government, and also historically, if I go back to South Korea of the 50s and 60s, that the government says, well, these are some of the sectors that we need to sort of, improve on and promote and become an export-based economy. And that was primarily on the basis of a very, finely tuned trade policy. What is your perspective on that?
I fully agree with you that the world has moved on where you had the room to actually plan the sectors in which you wanted trade policy interventions. And of course, the good practice now is to only set the basic rules and regulations and allow the private sector to choose where they want to go instead of the government playing a role where it wants to sort of have a guidance or provide guidelines of where private sector investment or even export interests should be directed towards. But having said this, Ijaz Sahab, you would know more than anyone that there are vast parts of Pakistan which are still not integrated with the export and production hubs of this country. And in those places, in those vast land areas, you still require enabling infrastructure based upon which your exporting industries would locate over there, would start producing whatever comparative advantage of those regions is. And those areas still require, if not policy, some sort of a strategic guidance from the state with regards to what would be the future outlook of public investment in infrastructure over there, which in turn can attract the private sector as well. And this is here, I think, I want to go back to your earlier point as well, when we were discussing the U.S.-Pakistan relations. One of the role that the state should play is improve donor coordination. For example, USAID had a very significant role. It still continues to provide technical assistance in the trade policy space, in private sector competitiveness space. But then there are so many other development partners as well. And the government needs to come forward and have a good donor coordination architecture on what is it that I need to learn from the Korean example or the US example or the EU example, and then invite the technical assistance to improve your trade policy outcomes.
Right, but there is also criticism of donor-induced policies. Once again, I think I'd probably refer to Dr. Nazimul Huq's work and critique of that. So I'm assuming, because one of the things that people talk about is the fact that donors bring in their own agenda. Now, I'm assuming that that's not what you're referring to. You're referring more to the kind of best practices that you can learn from them and other technical know-how. So just clarify that point with reference to the donor part of it.
Absolutely. I think the agenda should be set by the recipient country. Of course, it's the home country that should set the development priorities. But then there are areas where the home country may require technical assistance or capacity building. FATF is one such area, for example, where Pakistan has informed that there are maybe 1, 2, or 3 areas where it requires a technical understanding of issues. And this is where probably informed donors who have experience with FATF rules and regulations can help our banking sector, our regulatory sector to come up to speed.
Thank you. That was Dr. Vaqar Ahmed, economist and author, speaking with us. I'm now joined by Mohammed Asim, who heads investment management at MCB RF Habib Savings and Investments and is president of CFS Society, Pakistan. Mr. Asim, thank you for being with us. Very quick question with reference to, we constantly had this talk about Pakistan wanting to have a more than transactional relationship with the United States, something that's not just grounded in security, but has, other avenues. So give us a sense of where things stand with reference to trade and investment, and also what are the opportunities and challenges if we want to improve the situation.
Importance of U.S. in overall economic relationship cannot be overemphasized. U.S. is among the largest trading partners for Pakistan if you include the holistic relationship. For instance, within the exports, you have about roughly 18% share from Pakistani exports. Similarly, in terms of remittances, 15% of remittances are coming from the U.S., while U.S. has been one of the largest sources of foreign direct investment in Pakistan. So considering all the chains, U.S. is one of the very important partners, global partners for Pakistan. And in terms of relationship, we have been seeing there's kind of a standstill in terms of the growth and the overall economic relationship. Particularly the exports, they haven't been able to grow much. But having said that, that is the nature of overall exports that we have seen in Pakistan. It haven't been growing that significantly. However, now I think in the current environment, the few opportunities where Pakistan can look at to capitalize, now with the government's renewed focus on agriculture, I think this is one area we can learn a lot from US expertise. We can have their research in the seeds, pesticides, in terms of improving the yields of the agriculture sector. Similarly, in terms of our overall infrastructure, we have already improved, we have done a lot of investment in our energy capacity. Now, in terms of managing the overall energy infrastructure, there could be with opportunity. Similarly, there are several sectors, including hospitality, IT, is one of the sectors where government has been focusing a lot lately. We have seen support from State Bank as well. in providing this support and providing growth so that this can contribute significantly. I think US is one of the economies which can be importer of value-added into goods and services.
Mr. Asim, let me interrupt. Now, one of the things that we were discussing before you joined us had to do with the fact that there's need for Pakistan to interest the United States. Now, it's all very well, and I think it should be encouraged that we try and learn from US expertise in various fields. But we also need to develop, and this is a point that Dr. Adil Najam was making earlier on the panel, that we need to develop in areas where our presence becomes imperative. It's not just us trying to reach out to the United States, but the fact that, you know, our own nuisance value, if you will, increases with reference to what the US requires. Now, what are the areas where we can do that, if at all?
Yeah, so as I was saying, certainly the relationship has to be bilateral. So Pakistan has to offer its advantages, and it should be a mutually beneficial relationship. So one of the areas, again, if you look at Pakistan demographics, we are one of the largest, most populous country. We are the 5th most populous country in the world, and with a very young population. Now, that has been one of the strengths of Pakistan since early days. However, this is one area which again offers a big market for US entrepreneurs and corporates. In terms of the recent improvements, if you look at, I would like to highlight, there's been significant improvement lately in terms of the overall law and order situation in Pakistan. Over the last 5 years, we have seen significant improvement. One another area which I think has improved a lot is energy availability. So one of the areas, one of the reasons where businesses have not been in Pakistan, number one was law and order situation, and the other is availability of energy infrastructure, and the third is rest of the factors for attracting new businesses. So we have made improvement in those two sides. I think Pakistan can offer a lot in terms of, again, as I said, human resource capability. We have to, yes, Pakistan has to invest a lot to begin with in its human capital as well, but that would require obviously a long-term plan in this area.
Thank you. That was Mohammed Asim speaking with us. Joining me now is Ambassador Zamir Akram, a former diplomat with long experience of bilateral and multilateral diplomacy. Ambassador Akram, thank you for being on the program. Very quickly, the foreign minister has also spoken about this, and we've been hearing voices from Pakistan talking about a broad-based U.S.-Pakistan relationship, and something that's not entirely embedded in security or in Afghanistan. What are the areas, if any, where we can have that relationship with the United States, especially given the US's increasing relations with India and also antagonism towards China?
I think that what the foreign minister has stated is more of an aspirational objective rather than a clear-cut and hard and definitive foreign policy objective. In my view, the areas of cooperation with the U.S. in the present circumstances are extremely limited, and really speaking, there is no strategic convergence between Pakistan and the U.S., if there ever was any, but certainly at this time, I don't see such a convergence. You mentioned India and the Indo-US relationship, which is aimed against China, and on the other hand is Pakistan's own strategic relationship with China, which runs counter to Indian and American interests, particularly in the Asia-Pacific and particularly also in South Asia. So I don't really see any strategic convergence between the United States and Pakistan going forward. What there is a interest that the U.S. has, which is, I would say, largely tactical, and that is to ensure its withdrawal from Afghanistan and, if possible, to ensure a peaceful transition in that country, and if not, then how to manage the outcome, which is probably going to be, if there is no transition to a peaceful government or a peaceful transition, then obviously the dangers of a Afghan or a renewed Afghan civil war are very much there. So the US will be looking at how Pakistan can be helpful in trying to contain the fallout from that kind of a situation. Other than that, it is about the broader issue of counterterrorism, which remains a part of the Pakistan-US objective in this region and in Afghanistan particularly. But that's not necessarily, but that's, in my view, a sword that cuts both ways, because it is also an issue which the US continues to use against Pakistan. So that's not necessarily a good thing or a positive thing for us either. In terms of what else we can do, I think that there's really not much except for some soft issues like education, climate change, dealing with the pandemic, perhaps some kind of assistance in renewable energy. Those are the kind of areas, and perhaps even some limited economic assistance, but I find that difficult to expect any kind of sizable economic package from the US for Pakistan. So I think that's pretty much what we can expect. But certainly to talk about some kind of a new strategic, broad-based relationship between Pakistan and the US is unrealistic in my view.
Okay, so I was talking to some economists on the program, and they were of the view that Pakistan itself will have to step up to the plate in the sense that, it needs to interest the United States, or at least in some of the sectors be able to develop the kind of specialization or expertise which makes it important to the United States. That to me, obviously, in terms of being an argument, it's a solid argument, but it seems to me that the timeline on that is unlikely to be immediate. It's not something, because we haven't really been able to develop any expertise in any area where we can interest the world, like, for instance, cheap labor or, low-cost manufacturing, like China did once, or Vietnam does. So essentially, we are then left with the U.S. expertise, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's agriculture, and the rest of it. And it seems to me, and I don't know if you'll agree with me, that those areas will also get subsumed in the broader security issues when it comes to the crunch as far as the U.S. is concerned.
I agree with you entirely. I think that from the American perspective, Pakistan is no longer a country that is very much on the top of their priorities. This is very clear from the fact that since Mr. Biden has been in power since over 100 days, he hasn't yet even established any contacts with our leadership. Although at a lower level, they have been in touch where their interests require, such as with our military and our foreign office and others, vis-a-vis Afghanistan. So I entirely agree with you that these areas, the soft areas, will be overshadowed by the more difficult issues in the bilateral relationship. And I also think that you're right that we do not have the capacity to engage or attract the kind of American investment in Pakistan beyond and above what there already is. And I think a lot what we can do, of course, as you mentioned, that we need to step up to the plate. Yes, of course, there's room for more. But I think we need to do that. We need to improve the ease of doing business in Pakistan, providing a better security environment, political stability. These are the kind of things that investors anywhere, not just American investors, but investors anywhere look at before they put their money. into a country's economy. So these are some of the things that we will need to really improve, especially, I think, ease of doing business, which is somewhere an issue where we have lagged behind several countries in our region.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Ambassador Zamir Akram speaking. Thus, we shall take a short break and return to discuss a letter by India's Information Technology Ministry that instructs all social media companies to take down any content that refers to an Indian variant of the coronavirus. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Last Friday, India's Information Technology Ministry wrote to all social media companies asking them to take down any content that refers to an Indian variant of the coronavirus. The World Health Organization said on May 11th that the coronavirus variant B1617, first identified in India last year, was being classified as a variant of global concern. The Indian government, a day later, issued a statement saying media reports using the term Indian variant were without any basis, and WHO had classified the variant as just B1617. The IT Ministry letter says, and I quote from that, "This is completely false. There is no such variant of COVID-19 scientifically cited as such by the World Health Organization. WHO has not associated the term Indian variant with the B1617 variant of the coronavirus in any of its reports. Around the world, coronavirus variants have generically," and so this was what the Indian IT Ministry letter said. Now, as for the experts are concerned, they say that around the world, coronavirus variants have generically been referred to by doctors and health experts on the basis of where they are identified. This includes the UK, South Africa, and Brazil variants. To discuss this further, I am joined by Anant Bhan, a medical doctor who also researches in the fields of global health, health policy, and bioethics, and Aakar Patel, columnist, author, and former executive director of Amnesty International India. Let me begin with Dr. Bhan here. Dr. Bhan, so what is the technical situation? Some people, as I said in my opening, the doctors and others say that, you call it the UK variant because you found it there, you've got the South African or the Brazilian variant. So is it right to call it the Indian variant, or is the Indian government right in saying, no, you have to refer to its technical name as given by the WHO and not talk about it as an Indian variant?
Sure. Thank you for having me. So, the history of diseases being often referred to with geographical locations is old. I mean, if you look at the Spanish flu as an example, which was the prior big pandemic almost a century ago, which we all talk about in historical terms. In fact, there is no evidence to trace it back to Spain, but for some reason it took on the name of a geographical area, and that is how it was popularly known. There are many other diseases which also have connotations with regards to geography. You have the West Nile virus, you have Japanese encephalitis, you have Ebola, which is actually a river in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And these are all examples of how even now popularly those diseases are referred to. That having been said, there has been a lot of concern that there might be a level of stigmatization caused by linking a name of the disease to a geographical area. And this is a conversation we've had also with the origin of SARS-CoV-2, and hence the reluctance to call it, for example, a Chinese virus or a Wuhan virus, which is potentially going to again stigmatize China and Chinese populations. And we've seen elements of that in the past, for example, with the SARS outbreak in Canada and other parts of the world, where there was stigmatization of nationals or of those of Chinese origin. And hence we need to be cautious about it. But as we have also discussed, already there have been variants which have come in multiple other countries, and they've been referred to by the country where they were first reported from. So the UK variant, the South African variant. In fact, now within countries also you have variants coming in. For example, in the UK they talk about the Kent variant, and now another variant, I think, which is the Highlands variant, for example. So I think in popular terminology, these kinds of terms will continue to be used, but WHO in 2015 has now had a standard terminology, which is the scientific way of describing it. So, it is the B1.6.7.1.2 or so on that we talk about. So I think that is where the background is. There's going to be the scientific part to it, but I guess in popular terminology, it will continue to be used because that's what it is most comfortable for ease of speaking. In fact, the Indian government in some of its communication earlier officially has also used UK variant or South African variant. So it is a bit surprising that they are raising concerns on this when they have also used that terminology in the past. Now, what will be popularly comfortable for someone to say? For example, right now in India, we're dealing with a large number of cases of mucormycosis, but no one usually will call it mucormycosis. They all keep referring to it as black fungus, right? So that is an example of what the difference between how popularly a variant might be described versus what the scientific way of calling it might be.
Absolutely. So just to sort of, privately, I was talking to some doctors when I started reading up on this IT letter. And I said, is it right to, sort of refer to this patent through a geographical area? So one of them had an interesting explanation and said that, when the virus begins, the general practice now is to not refer to it in terms of a geographical area, not call it a Chinese virus or a Wuhan virus, or in the case of Spanish virus, which was actually declared a Spanish virus by the French, and it never started in Spain. But he also said that once the pandemic begins and you begin to get these mutations and these variants, then it's kind of normal practice to actually refer to them in terms of, as you also mentioned, in terms of where the variant is present. But let me pull in Aakar Patel here. Aakar, you heard what Anant Bhan was saying. Does it have anything to do with, in addition to, of course, the sort of, objection to referring to a geographical area, does it also have to do with the fact that the BJP government thinks that its handling of the situation hasn't particularly been impressive, and therefore it needs to do something to sort of, try and put down the idea of this being an Indian variant?
The government here is quite mindful of how it is seen, both externally and by the citizens here. And it would not surprise me what you said was the reason why they sent a letter out. Obviously, the government is in the right to say that there is no legal standing for a nomenclature of the sort that was used. Having said that, it is also true that supporters of the government, informally referred to as the IT cell here, have been using Wuhan and China quite a lot. But I think what's gone on in India over the last 45 days or so has led to the government being fairly defensive in the way that it is seen and the way that it is seen handling the pandemic. To my mind, that would be the primary reason why there would be some level of pushback. Also, social media is quite soft here. There are laws in place which the government can use to make sure that Twitter, WhatsApp, and Facebook comply for the most part with what it says. Legal notices are sent quite frequently. There was 2,200 of them sent in the first 6 months of last year, which is the latest data set that we have.
Okay, so some of the social media company executives speaking to various news outlets, including Reuters and AFP, was saying, well, even if we wanted to comply with this, the sheer volume of the reference and the posts and everything in the digital space is likely to make it almost impossible to do so.
Violation of law here either. There is no law that the government of India can cite when it asks social media networks to forbid the use on their platforms of words like, say, Indian virus. There is no crime. But it is also a fact that there is a committee that sits in Delhi that parses reports that are sent to it by the states and sends them along to Facebook and to Twitter and asks them to pull down content. The Wall Street Journal reported a couple of months ago that the senior management of these three firms had been summoned to Delhi and threatened with jail if they did not comply with what was sent to them. So they're quite wary What the government may not necessarily understand at this point is that Twitter content stays live only for about a day or so. There is no real point in trying to pull down a material of this sort. Even if it is seen as damaging, it's quite transient. And it seems to be the case that India is pulling back now and getting a grip on the second wave. So I think this wasn't really needed.
Absolutely. One final question, Aakar. So India obviously is also the biggest markets for Facebook and Twitter and various other platforms. So do you think that recent Indian government policies with reference to sort of, tightening the screws on social media platforms, when social media platforms seem to be used by people other than those that are supporting the government, which is generally the case with governments around the world, do you think it's somewhat self-defeating to do this?
No, I think it works quite well in the case of Facebook, which is different in a sense from Twitter. Facebook is fully aligned, shall we say, with the government of India and the BJP. It extracts a very large sum of profit, which has been transferred to it from traditional media firms. Twitter is different in the sense that it still claims or pretends to be upholder of free speech, and there is some level of pushback from Twitter. When some of us get suspended because of notices that the government sends to Twitter, it tends to be often the case that Twitter declines to do what the government asks it. Facebook, I would say, is complicit. That there's been a documentation to show that ruling party content that might even be in violation of the laws here in terms of incitement to violence and so on has not just been left on the site, it's been promoted. So I would say that Facebook has helped the government and continues to do so. Twitter has some level of pushback, but I think it's a much smaller medium than Facebook is.
Than Facebook. Thank you so much. That was Aakar Patel speaking with us. Before I wrap up, let me go back to Dr. Anant Bhan. So Anant Bhan, somewhat positive news, mercifully. Seems that the peak is gone, the second wave, while infection rates are still pretty high. And unfortunately, the mortality rate is also high. It's come down from 4,000, which are upwards of 4,000, which I believe where India peaked, and also 400,000 cases. Well, not 400. I think it was 300,000 cases per day. So that's something to celebrate, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, cautious optimism. I think cases have started to come down, and also, but at the same time, deaths continue to be high and are the highest anytime during the pandemic. Now, that might just be because there is a bit of a lag period between cases sort of peaking and its sort of downstream impact on deaths. But there are still some concerns also that we might not be getting adequate numbers which are accurate from rural India, where there is a lot of spread of infection. But overall, there is some level of decongestion of health facilities, and that is evidence from across India. So that is a positive. But still, I think we need to be cautious and keep following precautions and keep tracking the pandemic, because as we've seen, any complacencies is punished very severely by this virus. If that is one thing we've learned over the last 1.5 years, is that we should not be surprised by the virus striking back with vengeance. So we need to be extremely cautious.
Absolutely. Quickly, how bad is the situation with this black fungus thing? I believe I was talking to some people and they said this is something that happens in the subcontinent, but it seems to have suddenly sort of, exacerbated. Maybe because of the immune system, sort of, immunocompromised systems or whatever it is?
Yeah, so, it is sort of being described as an epidemic within a pandemic in India. And the reason is that you're absolutely right. While there is some base level of cases that you see, it's relatively a rare disease condition. But now we are seeing many more cases crop up in parts of India, and now it's being also reported from almost all sections of the country, but especially so in states like Gujarat and Maharashtra, many cases coming through on a daily basis. And the challenge here is probably the fact that already there is a high baseline of diabetes. In South Asia, many of our citizens have non-communicable diseases, including diabetes, or sometimes undiagnosed. The second thing is the use of steroids, sometimes which is not done following proper guidelines. And steroids end up also decreasing your immunity and enhancing your sugar levels. And then on top of that, you have to layer on hygiene issues, which might be making it easy for the fungus to spread, plus the use of antibiotics, etc., which means that the normal microbiota or the microbial atmosphere in your body might get disturbed and make it easy for the fungus to spread. The challenge with mucormycosis or black fungus, as it's being commonly referred to, is that if you don't identify it early enough, then it can be a complicated disease to cure. Case fatality rates can be high. And it does take, a bunch of specialists to treat it, which, again, in our countries are in short supply, and it can be an expensive proposition. The drug of choice, amphotericin B, is now also, having a shortage, and that is also, unfortunately, causing problems with the way we can respond as a health system.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your insights. That was Dr. Anant Bhan. This is all from In Focus this evening. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. The good news is that the overall positivity rate has come down in Pakistan to just about 3%. But to keep the trend down, get vaccinated, but keep following the non-vaccine safety protocols too. Good night and goodbye.